the way we process our experience is crucial for how we conduct ourselves in the world and how we can either be lost in confusion or gain in wisdom and move towards liberation. As human beings, we have a certain set of sensory apparatus. We have five physical senses, and each one has a limited range. The eye takes in light, which is electromagnetic radiation of a very narrow bandwidth. Hearing, we sense vibrations in the air, again in a limited range of the possible vibrations. With smell, we can detect chemical molecules in the air. A great many of them are completely undetectable to us. And our sense of smell for our species is not very developed compared to, say, a dog's. Likewise with taste, there's a limited range of stimulus that will activate taste. And touch is limited by sensitive tissue of the skin contacting objects. This provides only a narrow range of the total reality. We can never experience, it's not possible for us as embodied beings, as human beings, to experience the totality of the world. We only experience what we have the apparatus to experience. And this differs from individual to individual. Some people have sharper sight or hearing than others. And it differs from day to day, from time to time. You know, one might be tired and then the senses aren't as sharp. So we only have like a narrow range of signals coming in from the world. And this is first experienced on the physical level as a stimulation of the sensitive tissues, of the eye, ear, nose, and so on. And then it's known by the mind, and this is what's called the vijnana. Sense consciousness in Pali is the immediate sensation of this data, the mind knowing, in the case of the eye, color and shape. And in the case of the ear, it knows high or low pitched, loud or soft, and so on. At this stage, this is as close as we get to an actual external reality. But we have an additional layer of processing, is sanya, is perception, which is very critical for our actual experience of the world, is understanding the role of sanya, which is a purely mental function that takes that raw data and perceives, recognizes the experience, classifies it, names it. It's at this stage, essentially, that we experience the world in a practical way. And it's important to understand that this is at least a couple of steps removed from any ultimate reality. Not to fall into the delusion of naive realism. We're living in an approximation of reality. In essence, we're living in a mental simulation that we create with our mind from the incoming data. We create a world, an experience that we live in. For similar beings, the experience, the perception will be similar. It won't be identical. No one's perception is identical to another's. But for different classes of beings, very different from each other, the perception will be very different. You may have had the experience at one point of chopping a piece of wood that was old, and when you chopped it, it was full of ants, and they come scurrying out of the wood. The perception of that piece of wood by the human being and by the ant is quite different. To the ant, whose kind has multiplied and burrowed into the wood and built tunnels all through it, it's like a many-storied palace. All these tunnels and passageways and chambers, and seeing it from the inside out. To the human being, it's a relatively small, solid object defined as a piece of wood. The Zen teacher Dogen, in the Rivers and Mountains Sutra, he talks about the difference between all the realms is entirely the difference of perception. And his description of the world is all the realms overlap and they're just separated by perception. And he gives the example of a river that to a human being it's a river of clean water. To someone in the ghost realm, it's a river of filth. To someone in the hell realm, it's molten lava. And to a Naga, it's an abode of crystal palaces. Who's to say which perception is correct? One is as valid as the other. The relation point of the being to the external world is mediated by this process of sensing and perceiving. There's a text from the Chinese Huayan tradition that talks about the statue of the golden lion that the emperor has on the gateway to the palace. And he talks about how different people perceive this golden lion. The ignorant peasant from the country that comes into the city sees it and thinks it's a real lion and becomes afraid and runs away. The common townsfolk see it and they know it's a statue of a lion. They don't think much of it. They're used to it. It's just a statue of the lion outside the palace. The goldsmith sees it and he focuses on the quality of the gold, how pure it is, more or less perfect quality of the material. A sculptor sees it and he mentally critiques the work of the other sculptor, how realistic or how poorly done it is. And then he goes through various philosophers, various schools of philosophy that focus on it as a collection of atoms or as a phantasm of the mind and so on. Different philosophers, different ways of describing the underlying reality. There's also the well-known story of the blind men and the elephant. Blind men are examining an elephant and one feels its ears and thinks it's a winnowing fan. Another one feels its trunk and thinks it's a thick rope. Another one feels the legs and says this is the trunks of a tree, and so on. There's a couple of versions of that story. The one that gets sort of most commonly quoted is the Jain version, actually, where the point is that in the end is that there's no underlying reality. It's all a perception. There's a Buddhist version. The king is sitting up in the balcony. He set this up as an amusement. He brought the elephant and the blind men into the courtyard, and the king, he sees the whole elephant. And the king is, a representation of the enlightened mind. He sees the whole elephant. So the perception of an awakened one, of a Buddha, is different than the perception of an ordinary person, because he's not prone to delusion. And we're caught in the delusion of our perceptions continually. And then we add to that another layer of confusion. Another source of confusion beyond perception is proliferation. That the mind will spin imaginings, stories, and complications around what is experienced. And this is even a further remove from any underlying reality. We can get quite carried far away with proliferations. It's often, for example, a cause of misunderstanding and conflict between people is perception and proliferation, that we imagine from what someone has said or their body language or their actions that we can spin a whole story about what they're thinking and what they mean by it and so on, and it might be entirely off the mark. There's quite an amusing story I read once, written from a point of view. It's a couple, a man and a woman, and they're in a car together, and it goes back and forth between their different points of view. And it starts out with the woman saying, "Do you realize we've been going out for 6 months?" And the man just makes a noise like harumph. And then the woman spins this whole story in her mind about how, maybe he's not ready for commitment, and well, maybe I'm too pushy, and blah blah blah. And the man's thinking, 6 months. Geez, that's about the same time I bought this car. It's about time for an oil change. And it goes on, and then at the end of the story, she cries herself to sleep, and he just stays up late watching a basketball game. And it's, it's a silly sort of stereotypical story, but it illustrates the point of perceptions that we project onto other people. That you imagine things in our mind about other people, and this is very often a cause of friction in the world. Again, we're limited by our perceptions. And unless we're Buddhas, fully awakened beings, we never really 100% know what is going on with another person. We only have a limited range of communication with each other. All this about perception and proliferation is important because it governs our decisions and our actions so much. And we can't really dispense with it. We're caught in it to a large degree. We have to have some kind of a perception, but the aim should be to keep the mind fluid and open, and not be fooled into imagining that our perceptions, and certainly not our proliferations, represent any kind of ultimate reality. These ways of perceiving can be deliberately used in a cynical way. This is how, like, advertising and propaganda works. They manipulate people's perceptions to get them to want things or to believe things that are useful to another group. And if you're naive about how perception works, you can easily be caught in those kind of traps. When we're working on the spiritual path, we're trying with our meditation to get closer and closer to the bedrock immediate experience of reality. And in a single mind moment, the reality is the mind taking an object. And that object can be of one of the 5 physical senses, or it can be a mind object. And to see that process consciously, so one can experience the immediacy of the impingement. Now, this can be most clear, often it's most clear with the sense of sound, that we hear a high-pitched sound, and if we're not careful, we think we're hearing a bird. And the bird might very well be the source of the sound, but we're not actually hearing a bird. We're perceiving or imagining a bird. The experience is one of simply an impingement of sound, and it can be followed then by a perception of bird. This happens with vision too, but it's harder to parse that, to separate that, because it's so quick. The mind is very quick with perception, that we're actually only seeing color and shape. And it's technically incorrect to say that we're seeing a tree or a house or a dog. We're seeing color and shape, and we're perceiving those other things. And we're interpreting the data that comes in. And there's certainly a creative aspect to perception. That perception works to fill in the blanks. Example that's given in the old texts is someone walking at twilight and there's a piece of rope on the trail and he sees a snake because the mind is looking for being alert for danger and sees a rope and fills in the snake. I think what's a little bit more common here, if you're walking in the forest or along the road in the twilight, you can mistake a stump for a bear. And this is easy to do, and for a moment it can seem quite realistic because the mind fills in the details. We've all experienced, at some point playing with this faculty. You can look at clouds or in flames and see faces and things. This is a perception, from raw data is creating a reality that we experience. A good analogy for understanding how this works is to consider dreaming. At night when we dream, we experience a world and other people and other creatures, all sorts of things, and some of them quite fantastic. And this is not based on anything other than maybe fragments of memory. It's not based on incoming sense data. So the perception is entirely unconstrained. It's a very free perception. Perception just makes up a world. And it's the same mechanism, the same faculty that perceives the world of daytime, except that it's now working under a limitation of, okay, you've got this here data coming in, now make a world out of it. And sometimes if there's missing bits, the mind will fill them in. And there's optical illusions that demonstrate that, that will show the mind, something will be like some kind of a geometric pattern and there's lines missing and the mind will fill in the missing lines. And the only way to really see that they're not there is to cover up part of the picture with a cardboard so you can just see it and, oh, there's no line there. But the mind fills it in. So the effort should be to try and be fluid in your acceptance of reality, have a conditional relationship with reality. Recognize this is an approximation. This works, this is a functional approximation, but it's not ultimate reality. And then it becomes even more so with the next layer of abstraction, with proliferations, with our views and opinions. To hold those fluidly and realize these are metastructures that are built several layers away from reality. That they have a function, they're useful to order our lives and to have a way of dealing with things. If we didn't have any views, if we didn't have sort of metastructure, it would be sort of idiotic. We wouldn't be able to function on other than a very basic level. But if we take them as fixed expressions of ultimate reality, then we get caught. And inevitably it leads to suffering, because at some point we're going to be confronted with a situation where it doesn't work anymore. And if the self is invested in it, in the view, then we suffer because we try to defend it. It hurts. It's like our self is being threatened. What the Buddha recommended was holding views lightly, being ready to change, to shift the view when different facts present themselves. This is ideally how, for example, science is supposed to work in theory. is that any expression of reality is a model, is a hypothesis, and that when new data comes in, new measurements or new discoveries that don't fit in the old model, you just change the model and carry on. It was pointed out by historians of science that it doesn't work that way in practice, except in small shifts. Large shifts in the paradigm only happen when a generation of scientists dies away and then the younger ones come in. Because of the human factor, people have their ego, their self invested in a theory. If you're a professor of geology and you've made a whole career for decades and published books and had students, graduate students and so on, and everything is based around this kind of static Earth model, and then some guy comes along and with the theory of the continents are moving around. It would take someone of considerable internal integrity to be able to honestly appraise that and then change. Oh yeah, all the stuff I'd done for 40 years is wrong. I'll go with this now. And instead, there's kind of a digging into the heels and a protection of the intellectual space. And this happens in all kind of fields of endeavor. And there's something to watch for in ourselves. It becomes part of a self-view that our opinions, our models become perceived as a reality. The Buddha said that even his own teaching shouldn't be held too dogmatically. That should not become a source of quarreling and strife, and not with the attitude "this is right, all else is wrong," but should be taken as a guide for understanding. And there are plenty of within the Buddhist teachings, even if we just confine ourselves to the Theravada. Now you can find many different opinions about certain points, interpretations of the five aggregates, of the nature of citta, of the dependent origination, and there can be quite lively discussion and controversies around certain points. It's good to maintain a certain fluidity about that, not to be overly bothered, and not to have the attitude in the mind that there has to be just one right answer and I got to find it. But to keep the mind fluid and open and look at the different sides of the case. I think generally in the spiritual life, moving forward, progressing in the spiritual life, it's very much more useful to have a good question and hold it in the mind than it is to find the answer. I think it's a danger. The mind naturally wants closure, it wants things settled. And there's a danger of closing off avenues of exploration because we think we've got it figured out, and we shut that down, put it aside, roll up the scroll and put it away in the shelf. But if the mind remains open, this is very different from that. There's one of the hindrances is vicikiccha, translated as skeptical doubt. And skeptical doubt has also been translated as uncertainty. It's actually the play of the mind wanting to find certainty but not finding it. So it's agitated because it sort of bounces back and forth between different poles trying to settle. And this is another case where the translation becomes problematic because doubt in the sense of having an open mind, a free mind, is actually useful. And this is quite explicit in the Zen tradition. They talk about it, there's a saying in Zen that little doubt, little enlightenment, big doubt, big enlightenment. And what the doubt in this case means is having an open mind, having a the mind is free. It doesn't constrain itself. It doesn't try and force experience to fit into a model. In the end, it's the immediate experience that is as real as we can get. And that's what's crucial. And the models that we either learn through study or that we develop ourselves are removed from that reality. And it's not to say that they're useless. They have a function in allowing us to order things in the mind. But we ought to have a certain fluidity and an ability to move between models or to modify our models as we go. Okay.